My son told me he could not come to supper because a combine had thrown a chain, and I believed him, because in 51 years that boy had never once given me a reason not to. Then I drove into town for my blood pressure prescription, and I saw him through the front window of the Wagon Wheel Cafe, laughing with his head back, and there was a plat map of my farm unrolled flat across the table with a coffee cup holding down one corner. I stood on that sidewalk in the cold for a good long while, and the question I could not put down, the one that followed me all the way home in the dark with the heater blowing on my hands, was not why he lied to me. It was this. If he had already shown that map to strangers, how long had my ground been for sale without me? My name is Merle Odegaard. I am 78 years old. I live 9 miles northwest of a town called Ledyard Bend in Coldwater County, Iowa, on a place my father put a mortgage on in 1952 and I paid off in 1989. I spent 41 years working for the Farmers Cooperative, and 30 of those years I ran the scale house and the grain desk, which means for most of my life, my job was to tell people the truth about what they were hauling. Before I go any further, do an old man a small favor. Go look at your own kitchen windowsill, whatever is on it right this minute, and put it down in the comments. Not the nice thing on the mantle, the thing that has sat there so many years you have quit seeing it. A jar of buttons. A ceramic rooster. Somebody's wedding ring in a saucer above the drain. I am asking because this entire story turns on a piece of scrap brass on a windowsill that not one person on earth thought was worth anything except me, and I would like to know what is sitting on yours. All right? The scale. A truck comes up on the platform and the scale gives you a number. That number is called gross. It is everything. It is the corn and the truck and the tarp and the driver and the dog if he brought one. Gross does not tell you a single useful thing by itself. Then that same truck comes back empty and you weigh it again, and that number is called tare. Tare is what he was carrying before anybody put anything in him. And then you subtract, and what is left over is called net. And net is the only number in this world that anybody actually pays for. I have said that out loud to about 4,000 men in my life, standing at that window with a pencil behind my ear. You cannot get an honest net without an honest tare. Every argument I ever had in that scale house came down to somebody trying to hide his tare. I am telling you all of that because of a boy who came up my lane in April of 1988 with everything he owned in a kitchen garbage bag. His name was Ross. The county had him. He was 9 years old, and he had been in 3 houses in 14 months, and the woman who drove him out to us said he was quiet and he was no trouble and that we should not expect him to say much for a while. Arlene, my wife, took that garbage bag out of his hands at the bottom of the porch steps, and she did not look inside it, and she did not throw it away either. She set it on the washing machine like it was luggage. I have thought about that for 38 years. She gave that bag the dignity of being suitcases. He was ours legally when he was 11. Odegaard on the papers, Odegaard on the mailbox, Odegaard on the back of his baseball jersey. And here is the only thing I ever knew for certain about being his father. His tare was not his fault. Whatever weight that boy was carrying when he pulled up my lane in the county car, none of it was ever going to get subtracted out of him in my house. Not by me. Arlene was a teller at the Ledyard Bend Savings Bank for 34 years, and she was the superintendent of the swine barn at the county fair for 19 of them, and she died 3 years ago in March, 4 days after a hip replacement, from a clot that went to her lung. She was 74. She had picked out the ham for Easter. It was in the deep freeze with her handwriting on the freezer tape. I keep her brass kettle on the kitchen windowsill above the sink. It is not for cooking. It is a test-weight kettle, a little brass bucket that holds exactly 1 dry quart, and it comes with a wooden strike-off stick that has been worn down on one side to the shape of my thumb. You fill it with grain, and you draw that stick across the top, level, 1 pass, and then you weigh what is in the kettle, and that gives you pounds per bushel. That is test weight. That is how you find out whether a load is heavy corn or light corn, whether it is going to keep in a bin or go out of condition on you in February. 2 rules. You do not heap it. And you do not shake the kettle. A man who taps the side of that kettle while he is filling it to settle the grain down tight is a man who will do worse things later, and I have known that to be true my whole working life. Every fall, on the first load off the first field, I fill that kettle and I run the strike-off stick and I write the number on the back of the kitchen calendar. Field, bin, moisture, test weight, date. Then in January, I take the calendar down and put it in the bottom drawer of the buffet with the rest of them. There are 41 calendars in that drawer. I want you to remember that. That night, the night of the wagon wheel, I got home at 20 minutes to 7, and I did not turn the kitchen light on right away. I stood there in my coat. I had gone to town for a prescription. It was the 11th of September. It would have been our 51st anniversary, and for 3 years running, Ross and Roxy and I had gone to the Wagon Wheel on that date because Arlene liked the pie there, and that afternoon, he'd called me and told me about a chain coming off a combine on the Jaeger place. There were 5 people at that table. My son, a woman about 50 with the same square chin, which I knew because I had met her twice and been polite both times, her husband, a big fellow in a quarter-zip pullover, a young man in a press shirt with a folder, and my granddaughter Roxy, 16 years old, sitting with her coat over the back of her chair, eating a piece of pie on the 11th of September. There was a cake on the table. There was also a plat map, and I know a plat map from the sidewalk in the dark. I know section lines. 30 years of freight and storage, and I could tell you which quarter section any man in this county farmed by the way he stood in line. I did not go in. I want to be clear with you, because I have had 3 years to be honest about this, and if I'm going to tell you this whole thing, I am not going to come out of it looking noble. I did not stay outside because I was being dignified. I stayed outside because I was afraid that if I walked in, they would all be glad to see me, and it would turn out to be nothing, and then I would have to go home and eat by myself anyway, and I would have used up my one hard feeling for the week on nothing at all. So I drove home, and I looked at that calendar on the back of the kitchen door for a long time, and the number I had written in pencil on the 9th of September for the first load off the home 80, and I told myself that a map on a table is not a sale. He came out the next morning, which he did most mornings, because he farms my ground, and his shop is in town, and my lane is on his way to everywhere. Ross is 47. He is a big man with his mother's habit of standing at a doorway instead of coming all the way in. He runs Odegaard Ag Repair out of a steel building on the east edge of Ledyard Bend, and he does hydraulics and drive lines, and he is good at it, and he farms the 320 acres out here besides, and he has been tired for about 6 years, the way a man gets tired when he is running 2 things and neither one is quite paying for itself. I asked him straight. I said, "I was in town last night." He did not flinch. That is what I noticed later when I had time to notice things. He did not flinch, he just got sad around the eyes, which is a much more expensive expression to produce. He said, "Dad, I am sorry." He said Dana's birthday landed on the 11th and she wanted to do supper and he did not know how to tell me because how do you tell your father that you were eating cake with your other family on your mother's anniversary? He said Roxy has to come. He said the combine really did throw a chain on Tuesday and he had used it as an excuse on Wednesday and he was ashamed of that. And the map, I said. He laughed. He actually laughed and it was a good laugh, not a nervous one. He said Curtis is Curtis. He said Curtis has got a notion about the ground north of the interchange, and he brings that map everywhere, to church, to the shop, to a birthday supper, and it is a running joke in that family, and if I wanted, he would tell Curtis to leave it in the truck from now on. I believed him. I believed him, completely, all the way down, and that I drove out to the mailbox afterward feeling small and mean, and about 90 years old for having stood on a sidewalk in the dark, spying on my own son through a window like some kind of jealous man. Nobody warns you about that part of getting old. When you suspect somebody and you turn out to be wrong, it does not land on you as relief. It lands as evidence against yourself. Then he said, "Since I am out here," and he went to the truck and came back with a manila envelope. It was a delivery authorization for the cooperative. 1 page. It said that Ross Odegaard was authorized to haul, deliver, price, and settle grain on my account. He said it would save us both. A lot of nonsense. That D at the grain desk had been hollering at him about it since last fall, that half the time he was hauling my corn anyway and having to call me from the pit to get a verbal, and that if I signed it, he could just get it done. He handed me a pen. It was a pen from the implement dealer with a chewed cap. And I will tell you why I did not sign it, and it was not wisdom. Roxy was in the truck. She had ridden along, and she was sitting sideways in the seat with the door cracked, reading something on her phone, and when her dad put that pen in my hand, she looked up. That is all. She looked up over the top of her phone at the 2 of us standing in the yard, and then she looked back down at the screen too fast. 16 years old. She had known before I did. I said, "Let me read it tonight," and I put it in my coat pocket, and I asked her if she wanted to come see the barn cats, and she said, "No thanks, Grandpa," in the voice a teenager uses when she is trying very hard to be normal. They pulled out. I stood in the yard. And then, because I am who I am, I did not go call a lawyer, and I did not go call my son back. I walked out to bin 3. I have 5 bins in that yard, 2 old wooden cribs my father built that I use for junk now, and 3 steel bins on concrete that I put up between 1976 and 1991. Bin 3 is the big one. Bin 3 holds a little over 28,000 bushels when it is packed full, and it had corn in it from the year before last, held back because prices were sour and because I am the kind of man who would rather sit on a crop than take a number he does not like. There was a ladder on the outside of that bin, And there is a little glass port at the 8-foot mark where you can see the grain up against it, and I am 78 years old and I have a bad hip, and I have no business on a bin ladder, and I climbed it anyway with my coat still on. The glass was clear. There was no grain against it at all. There was just dark and a smell coming up out of that bin that was not the smell of a full bin. A full bin smells like a full bin. It smells warm. It smells like a living thing breathing at you. That bin was breathing empty. I did not yell. There was nobody in that yard to yell at. I came down that ladder one rung at a time the way you come down when your hands have stopped listening to you. And I went and got the flashlight out of the shop, and I opened the man door at the base of bin 3, and I put the light in there. You could see the floor. Not all of it. There was maybe 1.5 feet of corn spread out flat across the bottom, the way a bin looks in July after you have sold everything. Tailings and fines and a little cone up under the center where the sweep had not got to. I stood in that door, and I did the arithmetic in my head. The way I have done it for 50 years, feet of depth times the diameter factor, and I came up with somewhere under 2,000 bushels in a bin that should have had 26,000 in it. Then I walked over and I opened bin 2. Bin 2 was down about 1/3. Bin 1, the small one, was where it should be. I went in the house and washed my hands and pulled out a chair, and I did not call one living soul. The next stretch is the part of this I am least proud of, and it ran 7 weeks. I opened the bottom drawer of the buffet and I took out the calendars. 41 of them, 1985 on the bottom, and the top 3 are the ones that matter. I laid them out on the table, and I turned them to the fall pages, and I read my own handwriting. There it is, 14.2 moisture, 56.5 pounds test weight, home 80, bin 3, and the date. And then the next load, and the next, and the running total I keep in the margin because Arlene taught me to keep a running total in the margin of everything. Her whole life at that bank, she would not leave a column without a total at the bottom of it. She used to say a number that has not been added up is just a rumor. 26,400 bushels went into bin 3 across 2 harvests. I sold none of it. I did not price 1 bushel of it. I know that because when you price grain, you get a confirmation in the mail, and I have never in my life thrown away a confirmation, and there were none in the folder because there were none to be had. And there was about 1,800 bushels of it left. I sat there and I let myself understand it, one piece at a time, the way you let cold water get up your arms. He had a key to my shop. He had my trucks. He had the auger and he knew the combination on the bin doors because I gave it to him, and he had been hauling for me for 11 years. And every single fall, he backed up under my bins and moved my corn to town for me because I am old and because that is what a son does. And somewhere in there, he had stopped delivering it on my account. Now here is the thing about grain that people who did not grow up around it do not understand. Corn in a bin is not like money in a bank. There is no statement that comes in the mail. There is no balance you can look at on a screen. There is a steel can in your yard with a number in your head and a calendar on the back of a door, and the only person who knows what is supposed to be in there is you. It is the easiest thing in the world to steal from an old man, and it is not even hard to explain away, because bins settle and bins run, and a man can always say the auger was pulling from the wrong one. But I was not going to be able to say that, was I? Because I had the calendars. I did not call him. I did not drive to town. I went to bed at 9 o'clock, and I lay there with the window open listening to the corn dryer running over at the Jaeger place, and I made a decision that I have gone back and forth on ever since. I decided to wait and see if he would tell me. I told myself it was patience. I told myself a father gives a man room to come to him, and I got 7 weeks out of that story before I finally admitted what it actually was, which is this. I was not being patient with my son. I was auditioning him. I was sitting in the dark holding a scorecard he did not know existed, waiting to see whether he would walk into the room and hand me the truth on his own so I could feel good about him again. And a man who is being auditioned without being told is being cheated. I did that. Nobody made me do it. The next morning I got up and I made coffee in the 8-cup pot, which is the pot for 2 people, and I poured 2 cups and I drank hers standing at the sink looking at the brass kettle on the windowsill, and I said out loud, "Well, Arlene?" She did not say anything back. She never has, but I know exactly what she would have said, because she said it to me about 100 times in 50 years, and she said it every single time a customer came into that bank crying about a relative. Go get the paper, Merle. Do not go get the person. Go get the paper. The cooperative elevator sits on the north side of Leadyard Bend where the rail spur comes in, and I gave that place 41 years, and I still fill in 2 mornings a week during harvest because Ty Brubaker, who manages it now and who I hired when he was 19 years old and could not back a trailer, asked me to, and because I like it. I did not go in there and make a scene. I went in on a Tuesday in October with a box of Long Johns from the bakery like I always do, and I stood at the grain desk and I said to Dee Hovland, "Dee, would you print me off everything that is settled to my account for the last 2 crop years?" Dee has been at that desk for 30 years. She came the year I moved off the scale and onto the desk myself, and she has a way of looking at a screen where you can tell the difference between her reading and her thinking. She read. Then she thought. And she said, "Merle, do you want just yours, or do you want everything that came off your farm?" I want you to understand what she was telling me. She was telling me those were 2 different piles. She could not say more than that, and she should not have, because a grain desk cannot hand one man another man's settlement statements, and Dee Hovland is not going to break a rule she has kept for 30 years for a box of Long Johns. But she asked me the question. She made sure I knew there was a question to ask. I said, "Mine, for now." "Thank you, Dee." I took that envelope out to the pickup, and I did not open it in the parking lot because there were 11 trucks in line, and every man in one of them knows my truck. I opened it at the kitchen table. 2 crop years of settlements on my account: beans, some corn out of bin 1, a little seed corn contract. It was thin as a church bulletin. Then I called Ingrid Salvezan. Ingrid has an office over the old shoe store in the county seat, and she does farm estates and elder law, and she has been doing it for about 22 years, and she is the only lawyer I know who owns a pair of boots that have manure on them. She sat me down and she let me talk for 40 minutes without interrupting one time, and then she asked me for the calendars and she went through them with a ruler. And then she said the thing that changed the shape of the whole thing. She said, "Merle, before we talk about the grain, tell me about the ground." So I did. 22 years ago, when Ross was 25 and had just married and was working at the implement dealer, Arlene and I deeded him the North 160. Clean. A gift. Our lawyer at the time was an old man named Corwin who is buried out at St. Ansgar's now, and Arlene made us drive over there twice about it because she wanted something in that deed that I thought at the time was foolish. I did not remember the words. I remembered that I had signed something extra and that Arlene had made a point of it, and that Ross had rolled his eyes at his mother and said month over month, "I am not going to sell it," and she had said, "I know that, honey. This is not about you. It is about whoever owns it in 40 years. Ingrid pulled the recorded deed. It took her about 9 minutes at the recorder's office, and it cost me $12. There was a right of first refusal recorded on that 160, in my name for as long as I am living. It says, in plain enough English that even I could read it, that before that ground is sold to anybody, it has to be offered to me first, in writing, on the same terms, and I get a set number of days to take it or leave it. It was recorded the same day as the deed. It has been sitting in the courthouse for 22 years, where any title company on earth would find it in about 4 minutes. Nobody had offered me anything in writing. Then Ingrid asked me the second question, and she asked it in a very careful voice, the way a doctor asks whether it hurts when she presses there. She said, "Merle, who farms your 160, the one you kept?" "Ross does," I said. "Always has." "Is there a written lease?" "Never has been." I said, "He pays me cash rent in March, and we shake on it at the coffee shop. Has anybody served you a written notice terminating that tenancy?" I said, "No." I said, "Why would they? We do this every year." And Ingrid Salvezan took her reading glasses off, which I would learn is what she does about 4 times a year. She said, "Merle, in the state of Iowa, a farm tenancy does not just end because the year ends. It renews itself on the same terms for another crop year, unless one side serves the other with proper written notice on or before the 1st of September. Nobody served you. It is the 2nd week of October." She said, "Whatever anybody has been telling a buyer about delivering that ground free and clear next spring, they cannot do it. You have a lease for next year. You have it by operation of law, and there is not a thing on this earth they can do about it now, because the date is gone." And she put her glasses back on and she said, "So, now we can talk about the grain." Ingrid gave me 4 choices that afternoon, and she wrote them on a legal pad and pencil. 1. Send a demand letter and put everybody on notice right now. 2. Go to the county attorney today and let it be a criminal matter today. 3. Sign a release, forgive the whole thing, and never speak of it, which she said out loud is a real option that real people choose, and she was not going to talk me out of it. 4. Do nothing yet. File the paper that protects the ground, put the cooperative on written notice about the grain, and then simply let the harvest come, because the one thing nobody in his county can stop is that at some point every bushel has to cross a scale. I sat there and looked at that pad for a while. I have spent my whole life around men who think doing nothing is what you do when you have run out of ideas. It is not. Doing nothing on purpose is the hardest work there is, and it is the only kind of work where you have to keep deciding to do it every single morning. I picked 4. The next piece of this is Dana. And I have to go slow here, because it would be an easy thing to tell wrong. Dana Vickery is Ross's sister, his first sister. She found him 3 years ago through one of those spit-in-a-tube tests that people do at Christmas, and she called the shop, and I heard about it from Roxy before I heard about it from him, and I would like to say I took the news like a big man. I did not. I went out and split wood for 2 hours in 40-degree weather until my shoulder gave out, because here's what went through my head, and I am going to say it plainly. I thought, well, here comes somebody with a better claim. Which is a stupid thing to think. It is stupid the way jealousy is always stupid. A boy can have two beginnings, that was never the argument, and it never should have been. But I had spent 35 years quietly knowing that somewhere out there was a woman who had not come and got him. And now that woman's daughter was on my son's telephone being sweet to him, and something small and ugly in me sat up. Dana came out to the farm alone in the middle of October. She brought a pie, which is what you do in this county, and she stood in my kitchen with her coat still on, and she looked at the pictures on the refrigerator for about a minute and a half without saying anything. Then she said, "Was he a good sleeper?" That is what she asked me. Not about money, not about land. She wanted to know if her little brother slept. I told her the truth. I told her that for the first 2 years he slept on top of the covers with his shoes lined up, and that Arlene took his shoes and put them in the closet every night for 2 years, and every morning he got up and lined them up again, until one morning he did not, and Arlene came out to the barn and cried into a feed sack about it. Dana sat down at my table then, and I saw her face, and I understood something that took the top off my chest, which is that she has been carrying a tear too. She was 6 years old. She has spent her whole life being the sister who got kept. We had pie. It was rhubarb, but it was not as good as Arlene's, which I did not say. And when she was leaving, she stopped at the door with her keys in her hand, and she said, "Merle, Curtis gets excited about things." I said, "I know it." She said, "He means well." And then she stood there another second like she was going to say something else, and she did not. That was in October. I have gone over that pause 100 times. Because here's the part I did not know yet and would not know for 19 more days. Odegaard Ag Repair was 90 days behind at the parts house in Waterloo and had been put on cash terms in August. My son had bought a second service truck and a building he could not afford in a year when everybody in this county was fixing their own hydraulics because they could not pay a man to do it. He was into that building for more than the building was worth. He had not told his wife before she left, and he had not told his daughter, and he sure as hell had not told me. And Curtis Vickery, who is a big friendly man who used to put up hog buildings and now calls himself a farmland transition consultant and gets paid a percentage, had found a drowning man and handed him a plat map. I do not think Curtis ever said, "Steal your father's corn." I want to be fair. I have thought about it a lot, and I do not believe those words were ever spoken in that pickup. What I think he said, over and over for 2 years, in the friendliest voice in the world, was some version of this. "That ground is going to be worth a fortune when the terminal comes. Your dad is 78. It is all coming to you anyway. You are just getting there first." That is the whole sermon. It is 4 sentences long, and it has ruined more farms in Iowa than hail ever did. So I went about my business for 11 days, and I watched my son. He came out most mornings. He drank my coffee. He fixed the pull rope on the shop door without being asked, which he has done since he was 12. He looked at bin 3 one morning while he was talking to me about the Cubs, and he did not so much as turn his head toward it, and I understood then that he had gotten good at not turning his head toward it, and that took practice, and practice takes time, and that told me how long this had been going on better than any piece of paper ever could. One evening he stayed for supper and he washed the dishes, and he stood at that sink with his back to me for a long time. And I want you to know I gave him the room. I sat right there at that table, and I did not say one word, and I let the silence get long enough to walk through, and he dried his hands on the towel and he said, "Well, I better get. Before I tell you what happened at 6 o'clock the next Thursday morning, let me say one thing to you, and then I will leave you alone about it for the rest of this. If you have ever kept your mouth shut for weeks while somebody you love had every chance in the world to come tell you the truth, and they used every one of those chances to talk about the weather instead, then you already know what the inside of my chest felt like standing in that kitchen. Subscribe if that is you. Not for me. So that the next old man who tells one of these gets found by the people who understand it. All right. Thursday morning. The phone rang at 10 minutes to 6, which is the time of day when a phone ringing means somebody died or something is on fire. It was Dee. She said, "Merle, can you come in before we open?" She said, "Come to the back door by the office, not the drive." The elevator office at 6 in the morning in November smells like burnt coffee and diesel and the dust that never comes out of that carpet. Ty Brubaker was there in his coat. Dee was at the desk with the screen turned so I could see it, and a stack of paper next to the printer that was about 1.5 inches thick. Ty said, "Merle, sit down." Here is what a settlement statement is, for those of you who never had to look at one. When a truck crosses the scale, the ticket prints the gross and the tear and the net and the moisture and the test weight and the dockage, and it prints who is hauling and whose account it settles to and where the load came from. The man at the pit writes the origin on the ticket, farm name, field, or bin. It is not a formality. The state of Iowa licenses that elevator as a warehouse and a grain dealer, and every one of those tickets is a record with somebody's name on it. D had pulled 2 crop years. There were 119 loads settled to Ross Odegaard personally on his own account that had my farm written in the origin box. Some of them said Odegaard Home 80, some said Bin 3. 14 of them, in the middle of last November, said Bin 3 in my son's own handwriting, which I have known since he was making his R backwards in the 2nd grade. 24,640 bushels. People always want to know what a man does in a moment like that, so here it is. I set my coffee cup down. That is what I did. I set it down on the desk very carefully so it would not make a noise, and I looked at the wall where the calendar from the seed company was hanging, and I read the whole thing. Every square. All the way through the end of the month. Ty said, Merle, I have to tell you that as of right now I have a licensed obligation here and I cannot know this. He said, and there is a second thing. He said, we asked. He said D has been after him for a signed delivery authorization for 2 years, and he kept saying he would bring it in. He said, we should have quit taking those loads a year ago. And I will be answering for that to the department and to my board, and I am not going to dress it up for the man who trained me. I said, Ty, you took a load of corn from a man's son. That is the most normal transaction in the state of Iowa. He said, yes, sir, and it is going to stay the most normal transaction in the state of Iowa right up until it is somebody's father sitting in that chair. Dee had already printed it all. She had already put it in an envelope with a rubber band around it. She had done that at 5 in the morning before she called me, and she had done it because she had been asking herself a question for 2 years and had finally gotten tired of the answer she kept giving herself. Then she said the only thing she has ever said to me in 30 years that I will take to my grave. She said, Merle, I did not want it to be him. I want you to have that. They came out to the house that Sunday after church. 3 vehicles. Ross brought a coffee cake. Curtis Vickery brought the plat map and a folding easel in my kitchen, and the young man in the pressed shirt from the wagon wheel turned out to be a fellow named Brady Clum, who works for an outfit called Rivergrade Land Partners out of Cedar Rapids, and he brought a folder with my name printed on the tab. Dana was not there. I noticed that. They were kind about it. I want to be truthful. There was no yelling, and nobody threatened me, and Curtis called me sir about 40 times. That is how it actually happens, by the way, for anybody out there waiting to be able to spot it. It does not come in shouting. It comes in a nice sweater with a coffee cake. Brady Clum explained about the rail spur and the fertilizer plant and the terminal, and how Rivergrade needed 640 contiguous acres, and how they had Ross's 160 under agreement already, subject to assembling the rest, and how the number they were prepared to talk about for my 160 was a number that, I will admit to you, made my ears ring a little. It was more than my father made in his entire life. It was more than I made in mine. And then Curtis leaned in and did the part he gets paid for. He said, Merle, the beautiful thing here is you do not have to do anything. He said, Ross handles the operation anyway. He said, you sign a limited authority so he can execute at closing, and you never have to sit through one of these meetings again. He said, at your age, nobody should have to be reading purchase agreements. And Ross said, Dad, it is just so you do not have to worry. Then Curtis said the last piece, and he said it very gently, and it is the piece that told me what these people had actually been building for 2 years. He said, and if it would put everybody's mind at ease, Dana's doctor down in Cedar Falls does a real thorough memory evaluation, just a baseline, just so nobody can ever come along later and say, Merle Odegaard did not know what he was signing. I sat in my own kitchen, in the chair I have sat in since 1971, with an envelope of settlement statements in the buffet drawer 6 feet behind that man's head, and I listened to somebody offer to have me examined. About the grain, I said nothing at all. I said, this is a lot for a Sunday. I said, let me have a week. They were happy. That is the thing that has stayed with me. They were so happy walking out to those trucks. Curtis shook my hand with both of his hands, and Brady Clum said, what a pleasure, and my son stood on the bottom step and told me he loved me, and I said it back, and I meant it, which is the worst part of this whole story. Then I went inside and I called Ingrid Salveson at home on a Sunday, and I said, Ingrid, it is time to go get the paper. Here is everything I did that week. It is not dramatic. I am telling you anyway, because if any of this ever happens in your family, it is going to be this boring, and it is going to matter this much. On Monday, I signed a written revocation of any authority for anybody to haul, price, deliver, or settle grain on my account, and Ingrid sent it certified to the cooperative and to 2 other elevators within hauling distance, and Ty Brubaker signed for it and put a copy in the front of the file. On Monday, I also gave the cooperative written notice that there was a dispute over ownership of grain that had been delivered from my farm, and Ty put every future load from that address into storage as unpriced with the ownership marked in dispute, which is not a favor to me. That is what a licensed warehouse has to do. On Tuesday, Ingrid sent one letter and one only, and it did not go to my son. It went to the title company in Cedar Rapids that was doing the work for Rivergrade Land Partners, with a certified copy of the right of first refusal recorded 22 years ago, and a short paragraph noting that no written offer had ever been made to me, and a second short paragraph noting the date of the 1st of September had passed with no notice of termination served on the tenancy of the adjoining 160. That is it, 2 pieces of paper that had been sitting in a courthouse the whole time. On Wednesday, Ingrid drove me to the county attorney's office because she said she was not willing to sit on 119 scale tickets. And she was right, and I knew she was right, and I went anyway like a man going to have a tooth out. The investigator's name is Norma Quist. She's about 50 and she has a flat, kind way of talking. I asked her the question I had been carrying since 6 in the morning on Thursday. I said, if I decide I do not want this, can I stop it? She said no. Hee. She said, Mr. Odegaard, I understand exactly what you are asking me, and I am going to give you the honest answer instead of the comfortable one. She said, it is not only yours. She said, the elevator is licensed and it is already reported. She said, once a thing like this is on paper in a regulated business, it stops being a family matter and starts being a file, and the only choice left to you is what kind of man you are inside the file. And then she said, but you can tell me the truth about him, all of it, the good with the bad, and I will write down every word of it, and a judge will read it. So that is what I did. I sat in a county office for 2 hours and 40 minutes and told a stranger about a 9-year-old boy with a garbage bag. Roxy came out on Thursday after school by herself, driving her dad's old pickup with the bad clutch. She did not want anything. She wanted to sit in the kitchen, which is what that girl has wanted since she was 4 years old. She looked at the brass kettle on the windowsill and she said, Grandpa, why do you keep a bucket by the sink? So I took it down and I showed her. I filled it out of the sample bag on the porch, and I handed her the strike-off stick, and I told her the 2 rules. Do not heap it, do not shake it. And I told her that the whole trick of an honest business is that you decide what level means before you find out whether you like the number. She ran that stick across the top, and she did it too fast the first time, and spilled corn on my floor and laughed, and did it again, slow, and got it. And then she said, without looking up, Grandpa, is my dad in trouble? 16 years old? I have thought about that moment more than I have thought about the scale house, because I had about 4 answers available to me, and 3 of them were lies, and one of them was going to sit in that child's chest for 40 years. I said, honey, your dad did something that is going to cost him. I said, it is not yours. I said, you did not do it, you did not know it, and there was nobody in this county who was going to hand you a bill for it. And I said, I am not quitting being his father over it either, so do not you lie awake one night wondering whether this house closes to any of you, because it does not. She cried. I let her. I did not tell her it was going to be fine, because I do not lie to that girl. Then she said, can I still show my heifer? And I said, you are going to show your heifer. And I am going to be standing at the rail like I have been standing at that rail since before your father could drive, and the swine barn will still have your grandmother's name on the sign, and the fair does not care one thing about any of this. That is the whole conversation. It took 9 minutes. It is the only part of this entire story I would not change. Then came the 8 days. Because after Ingrid sent that letter to the title company, nothing happened. Nothing at all. And that was the strangest week of my life, worse than the week after Arlene died, because in that week at least everybody knew. The telephone did not ring. Ross came out Tuesday morning and drank coffee and talked about a bearing on the auger. Curtis called me twice with big friendly voicemails about scheduling. Somewhere in Cedar Rapids, a title examiner was working through a chain of title on 160 acres in Coldwater County, and I knew exactly what she was going to find and exactly what drawer it was in, and I could not have stopped it if I had wanted to. That is the thing about the paper. Once it is recorded, it is not yours anymore. It belongs to everybody. That is the entire point of recording it. Arlene understood that in 1994, standing in a lawyer's office in a print dress, and I did not understand it until I was 78 years old. And on the 9th day, on a Saturday morning in the first week of November, with corn coming in hard and a line of trucks out to the blacktop, I took my shift in the scale house because I had told Ty in August that I would. I want to be plain about something. I did not arrange it. I have heard people say since then that I laid a trap for my son, and I understand why they say it, and I am going to tell you the truth as clearly as I can. I did not need a trap. Corn has to be weighed. That is not a scheme, that is arithmetic. Every bushel that comes out of every bin in this county has to cross a certified scale in front of a person whose job it is to write down what it is and where it came from. I did not invent that. I gave 41 years of my life to it. The only thing I did was show up for a shift I had already promised. At 20 minutes to 8 that morning, I looked out that window at a line of 11 trucks, and the fourth one in line was a green tandem with a gray tarp and a shop name on the door. Odegaard Ag Repair. And behind it, parked over by the fertilizer shed where he could watch, was a white crew cab pickup with Curtis Vickery sitting in it and a car I did not know parked next to it, and Brady Clum standing between the two of them with his arms crossed, waiting to see a load of corn get weighed. They were not there for me. I found out later they had driven up from Cedar Rapids that morning to find Ross, because the title company had called Rivergrade on Friday afternoon, and Rivergrade had called Curtis at supper time, and Curtis had spent the whole night trying to reach a man who was not answering his phone. They'd come to the elevator because on a Saturday in November, the elevator is where every man in this county is. The green tandem rolled up on the platform at 10 minutes to 8. I want to describe the next 4 minutes carefully because it is the last thing in my life I expect to be asked about. The scale reads gross first, 80,240 pounds. Dee was at the desk beside me and she took the ticket off the printer and she did not hand it out the window. She said into the speaker, "Ross, I need you to come inside." He came in. He had his cap in his hand out of habit, because you take your cap off in the scale house. His grandfather taught him that. And he saw me sitting on the stool by the window in my chore coat, and he stopped in the doorway, the way he stops in every doorway. He said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" I said, "Saturday." Ty came out of the office with a file, and Ty did it exactly right, which I will be grateful to that boy for until I am in the ground. He did not accuse anybody of anything. He read the record. He said, "Ross, we are holding this load." He said, "On the 4th of November, this elevator received written revocation of your authority to deliver, price, or settle grain from that farm, and written notice of an ownership dispute, and both are in the file with a certified receipt." He said, "That means I cannot pay you for this corn, and I cannot pay anybody else for it either. It goes into storage, unpriced, ownership disputed, until somebody with more authority than me says whose it is." And then he set the stack down on the counter and he said, "And Ross, we have been asked for the last 2 crop years of settlements out of that address, and the department is going to want them, and so is the county attorney. So I am going to say this in front of witnesses in my own scale house. 119 loads, origin written in your hand, settled to your account. I have seen a lot of men get bad news at that window. Hail, aflatoxin, a wife in a hospital. I have never seen a face do what my son's face did." Curtis Vickery came through the door about then, because Curtis is a man who walks toward a room he is losing, and he started in about how there was no need for any of this, and how it was a family bookkeeping matter, and it would all be cleaned up at closing. And that is when Ingrid Salvezan stood up from the bench by the coffee pot where she had been sitting since 7:15 with a thermos and a folder, because I had asked her to be there and I had told her she would probably be wasting her Saturday. She did not raise her voice. She has never raised her voice in her life. She said, "Mr. Vickery, there is not going to be a closing." She laid the first page on the counter. She said, "This is a right of first refusal recorded against that 160 acres 22 years ago and running in favor of my client for his lifetime." She said, "That ground cannot be sold to anyone until it has been offered to him first in writing on identical terms. No such offer has ever been made. Any purchase agreement executed without it is not going to survive title work, and it did not, which is why you are all standing in an elevator on a Saturday morning." She laid the second page down. She said, "And this is the tenancy on the adjoining 160. It renewed by operation of law on the 2nd of September because no written notice of termination was served on my client on or before the 1st. Whatever anybody promised about delivering that ground free of tenants next March, that is not a thing that can now be done. The date is not negotiable. The date is gone." Brady Clum did not argue. I have to give him that. He is young, and he works for people who will fire him. And he looked at those 2 pages for about 8 seconds, and then he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And he rolled up the plat map and he walked out to his car, and he never said one word to Ross Odegaard. Not one, which I thought was the cruelest thing I saw that day. And Curtis started talking again. He was talking about how none of this was his doing, and how he had only ever been trying to help this family. And a car door shut outside. Dana had come. She had driven up behind them from Cedar Rapids in her own car because Curtis had been up all night on the telephone and she had finally asked him what was going on and he had told her some of it. She came in that door in her church coat and she looked at the stack of settlements on the counter and at her brother standing there with his cap in his hands. And she asked him one question. She did not ask it mean. That is what made it what it was. She asked it the way you ask somebody something you already know but need to hear. She said, Ross, whose corn is this? And my son stood in a scale house full of men he has known his whole life, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out of it. I got off that stool. I said, Ty, shut the scale down for 10 minutes and send them around to the North Pit. He did it. 11 trucks went around the back of that elevator, and every driver in every one of them knew something had happened, and not one of them ever asked me about it, which is the single best thing I can tell you about the men in this county. I took my son into the office and shut the door. I did not yell at him. I have thought about why, and the honest answer is that I did not have any yelling in me. I said, sit down, and he sat down, and then that big grown man put his face in his hands and cried like he was 9 years old on my porch steps. He told me the number. It was worse than mine. He had been doing it a little at a time for 2 years, the way you take money out of your own pocket at a fair, and he had never once written it down. And when I asked him what he thought was going to happen, he said the only true thing anybody said all day. He said, I thought the terminal would close, and I would put it all back, and you would never have to know I was in trouble. And I said, why did you not come to me? And he said, Dad, how do you walk up to the people who took you in and hand them a bill? There it is. That is the whole thing, right there. Everything Arlene and I ever gave that boy, every dollar and every Christmas and every school shoe, had stacked up over 38 years into a wall so high that when he finally needed help, he could not climb back over it to ask. I did that, not on purpose. But I did it, and I never once thought to tell him the account was closed and had always been closed and there was never anything on it. So I told him that day, sitting in a grain office that smelled like burnt coffee, at 47 years old, about 30 years too late. What came after is not the ending anybody would pick. The county attorney charged it. That was never mine to stop. Ingrid told me it would likely resolve without prison for a first offense with full restitution, and it did. And I did not ask for prison, and I did not ask for mercy either. What I did ask for, in writing, was 3 things. That the money come back on a real schedule with a real signature on it. That he sell the building in town, which he did in February, at a loss to a fellow who put a tire shop in it. And that he stand up at the cooperative annual meeting in March and say what he did in his own words in front of the men whose elevator he put in the middle of it. He did that. It took him 4 minutes. Nobody clapped and nobody booed, and afterward 11 men shook his hand. And Ty Brubaker got a letter of reprimand from the state and hung it on the wall of the scale house, framed, where every driver can read it. Curtis Vickery lost the contract and does not consult on farmland anymore. Dana calls me every other Sunday. She came to the fair in July and stood at the rail with me and Ross, the 3 of us in a row, and when Roxy brought that heifer around the ring, Dana grabbed my arm without knowing she was doing it. Ross farms my 160. Same handshake. We wrote it down this time, and on the first load off the home 80 this fall, I stood in the yard with my granddaughter, and I put the brass kettle in her hands and the strike-off stick in the other, and I told her the 2 rules again, and she leveled it clean on the first pass, and I told her the number was hers to write on the calendar now. Then I gave her both of them to keep. The kettle and the stick. She has a shelf in her dorm room in Ames with a 100-year-old brass bucket on it. This is Merle Odegaard up in Coldwater County, Iowa. I'm going to leave you with the only thing I know for certain after 78 years and 41 of them on a scale. Every one of us pulls up on the platform carrying something that got loaded into us before we had any say in it. That is your tear, and it is not your fault, and no decent person is ever going to charge you for it. But you have got to let it be weighed. Because a man who will not let anybody see his empty weight will spend his whole life hauling loads that nobody can ever pay him for. Go tell somebody in your family, out loud, this week, that there is no bill. Say it in plain words while you are both still here to hear it. And then, when the 2 of you are done being kind to each other, go put it in writing and go have it recorded, because a promise that only lives in a kitchen dies in that kitchen. Do not heap it. Do not shake the kettle. Level 1 pass and take the number.